All right, Ninja Nerds, in this video, we're going to continue our discussion about the adrenal gland. If you guys haven't already, go and watch the video on the adrenal gland where we talk about the zona glomerulosa, okay? In this video, we're going to focus on the zona fasciculata, okay? So zona fasciculata is, again, this middle layer of the adrenal cortex, because there's three layers of the adrenal cortex, right? This orange layer was the zona glomerulosa. We talked about that one. This green one is the zona fasciculata, okay? So what's this layer here called, this green layer? It's called the Zona Fasciculata. Okay, Zona Fasciculata. It's this middle layer here, and it's responsible for secreting a specific hormone that we put in the category of glucocorticoid. So cortisol is the specific one. And then the other part of the adrenal cortex is this purple layer, which is the zona reticularis. And we'll talk about that one next. Okay? So zona fasciculata, where does all of this response for this guy to make this hormone start? It starts in the hypothalamus. So in the hypothalamus, you have these specific nuclei. You see these red nuclei up here in the hypothalamus? These red nuclei are called the paraventricular nucleus. And these nuclei are responsible in the hypothalamus for secreting a specific type of hormone. This hormone that they release is called corticotropin releasing hormone, so CRH. Again, it's called corticotropin releasing hormone. That corticotropin releasing hormone comes down through the hypophyseal portal system and stimulates the corticotropes that are present within the anterior pituitary gland. When these corticotropes are stimulated by corticotropin releasing hormone, they secrete into the blood adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, so again, what is this hormone here called? It's called adrenocorticotropic hormone. Once this adrenocorticotropic hormone is released from the anterior pituitary by the stimulus of corticotropin releasing hormone, ACTH then moves and goes to stimulate the zona fasciculata. So what we're doing here is we're blowing up a cell of the zona fasciculata, and we're taking a very deep look at the molecular mechanisms involved. So let's follow this adrenocorticotropic hormone over here. So look what the adrenocorticotropic hormone does. It comes over here and it binds onto this G protein coupled receptor. See this orange protein here? That's a G protein coupled receptor. It's a part of the cell membrane. So when adrenocorticotropic hormone binds onto this receptor, it activates, you guys should already know this by heart now, a G stimulatory protein. Normally G stimulatory proteins is bound to GDP, which keeps it off. But whenever ACTH binds, it takes and binds GTP to the G stimulatory protein. And then GTP turns the G protein on. Once this G protein is on, it's activated and it moves along the actual cell membrane. When it moves along the cell membrane, you guys know that there's an effector enzyme that's a part of the cell membrane. Look at this guy. This guy right here is called Adenylate Cyclase, right? And what does this guy do? Once it receives the stimulus from this G stimulatory protein, he then takes ATP and converts it into cyclic AMP. And then look what cyclic AMP does. It activates a special enzyme, and this enzyme is called protein kinase A. And you know that kinases are responsible for phosphorylating different types of proteins. Proteins in what? Okay. So you guys have already known that we've already gone through transcription and translation where we take DNA to make mRNA, mRNA to make proteins, but those are for protein hormones. You know, in this cell, we're making steroid hormones. Steroid hormones don't come from DNA or from mRNA. They come from a basic unit called cholesterol. So what is that molecule called? It's called cholesterol. So cholesterol is the basic unit for the synthesis of steroid hormone, not DNA, not mRNA, not proteins. We're making steroid hormones. So what happens is cholesterol actually gets converted into what's called pregnenolone. And then pregnenolone actually gets converted into what's called progesterone. And then progesterone actually gets converted into what's called 17-hydroxyprogesterone, and then into 11-deoxycortisol, and then look into cortisol. This is the one that we care about. We care about cortisol. The whole point of me going through this pathway was to show you that before we were taking DNA, converting it into mRNA, and then translating it to make proteins at the ribosomes. Now we're starting with a different thing. We're starting with cholesterol and using all these different types of intermediates to get to cortisol. Cholesterol is the starting point now. Now, out of all the enzymes that control all of these steps, one of the more important enzymes is right here. And I'm just going to put it down because we're going to talk about it later. And this one's called 21-hydroxylase. Okay? Called 21-hydroxylase enzyme. And he catalyzes this step, the conversion of 17-hydroxyprogesterone into 11-deoxycortisol. Now, where is this protein kinase A going to be involved in here? He's actually helping to stimulate a lot of these enzymes. So you know how 21-hydroxylase is acting in this step? Well, there's multiple enzymes. There's enzymes working in this reaction, enzymes working in this reaction, enzymes working in this reaction, and even enzymes working in this reaction. Protein kinase A is phosphorylating different types of enzymes involved within this enzymatic reaction to produce cortisol. Okay? So now, if protein kinase A is phosphorylating a lot of these enzymes involved in this pathway, it's going to help to lead to the synthesis or the formation of cortisol. So that's why adrenocorticotropic hormone is one of the strong stimuli for cortisol synthesis. Why? Because it stimulates this intracellular pathway to make pKa, protein kinase A, which phosphorylates enzymes for the synthesis of cortisol. So now we've made cortisol. What is cortisol going to do? He's going to get pushed out into the blood. But you know, cortisol, he's special. Cortisol is special because he can't be in the blood in free form. He's a lipid-soluble hormone or steroid hormone, right? So he's not water-soluble. He has to be bound to certain types of transport proteins. So there's two transport proteins. Let's say I bifurcate it here, and I bifurcate it here. And here's our cortisol, this little purple dot here. He's going to bind on to two different types of transport proteins. Let's say that we use one as an orange. One's an orange transport protein, right? Look at this guy. About 25% of the actual steroid on this cortisol is actually bound to this one, so about 25%. This one is called, that orange protein is called albumin, okay? The other 75% of it is bound onto this nice little blue transport protein, about 75% of it. And this protein right here is called corticosteroid binding globulin. Okay? Another name for it is actually called transcortin. Okay? So that transcortin or corticosteroid binding globulin is actually carrying and transporting most of the cortisol. Okay? Now, cortisol gets transported to multiple different target organs through the blood. What are some of these target organs? Let's start with the muscles. So let's say cortisol comes out here. When cortisol comes over to the muscles, so let's say cortisol comes out here, and he acts on the muscles. You know, inside of our muscles, we have proteins, a lot of proteins that make up a lot of different types of myofilaments or other different components. So let's say here I represent these proteins here as like this squiggly-like structure, right? And these little red dots that I have on it are amino acids, because amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, right? And how do you identify proteins? One has a amino terminus and the other one has a carboxy terminus, right? So there's our protein. Look what cortisol does. Now, cortisol is a steroid hormone, so the only way he can work is he has to come into this cell, and let's say here's your DNA. He has to activate specific types of intracellular receptors, right? So what he'll do is he'll stimulate, right? Because he can actually move through the cell. He can move to the cell, bind onto an intracellular receptor, and activate a specific gene. That gene will make mRNA, it'll get transcribed, right? And then it'll get translated to make proteins. Look what these proteins are going to do. Let's say I draw this protein like this. What is this? Little scissor enzymes. These enzymes are going to start cutting up the proteins. They're proteases. Proteases break the peptide bonds. And look what you release out of this reaction. Out of this reaction, look what gets released into the bloodstream as a result. All these different amino acids. So all these amino acids, those little circles, are released into the bloodstream. So what are these things here called? These are called amino acids. okay? So these amino acids are the building blocks of this whole thing, which is called proteins, right? So we have proteins here that are getting broken down, catabolized into amino acids. So what's it doing in this area right here? What's it stimulating? It's stimulating protein catabolism. Why? We'll see. Okay. These amino acids, they're going to get used for something. They're going to get taken up by the liver, and we'll explain why in just a second. Okay. Next thing, let's look at what it does on the fat tissue. So we already know what it does on the muscles. Let's see what, and also, not only does it do it on the muscles, guess what else is doing it too? It can even come over here and stimulate the protein catabolism in the bone. So not only is there going to be protein catabolism in the muscles, but there's also going to be protein catabolism within the bone. So then look what comes out of this. Look what comes out of this. Amino acids. Right? And that's also going to occur in some of the connective tissues as well. So not only is there going to be protein catabolism in the muscles, but there's going to be protein catabolism within the bone and certain types of connective tissues. So we release amino acids into the bloodstream. So the amino acid levels in the blood are going to go up because of protein catabolism. And they'll be taken up by the liver for a specific function. And we'll see that in a second. Let's look at the adipose. How is it affecting the adipose? So same thing. Let's say that the cortisol comes up here, and it comes in and it acts on a adipocyte, right? Because that's what you call them. Collectively, it's called adipose tissue, but each one of these cells are called adipocytes. These adipocytes, remember, cortisol is a steroid hormone, so it moves through the cell, activates an intracellular receptor, stimulates specific genes to make mRNA and then proteins. Look what these proteins are going to be. You've already seen these proteins. You see these little scissors again? Look what these scissors are doing. They're cutting these triglycerides. Why are they cutting the triglycerides? They're going to cut the triglycerides right here at this point there. There's two components of a triglyceride, right? What are the two components? When this guy starts breaking this triglycerides out, it's going to break it down into two different components. One component is actually going to be glycerol. Okay? That's that, like, we'll represent it by the head, right? That little circle there. That's the glycerol. The other components are going to be the fatty acid chains. So these are your fatty acids. And these fatty acids can either be utilized over the muscles or they can be redeposited or redistributed to different parts of the body. Okay? So fatty acids can be utilized by the muscles or they can be redistributed and relocated to different parts of the body. But now this glycerol gets taken up by the liver for a specific reason, and we'll talk about that. Okay. Cortisol also loves to act on the liver itself too. So let's say that we have cortisol here. He's also not just going to, so here was our cortisol. We'll represent it by that little purple dot there. Here's, and again, cortisol, look what he's going to do. He's going to come out here, and he's going to act on the liver. So you know how inside of the liver we have, these liver is actually made up of hepatocytes. So inside of this you'll actually have specific DNA. So here's the nucleus. Let's say it stimulates the nucleus here, activates specific genes. And look what these genes are going to do. Well, first off, here's what you need to remember. You're taking these amino acids and you're taking this glycerol in. We can take this glycerol and these amino acids. Now look what happens here. I'm going to take the glycerol and I'm going to funnel into a specific pathway. I'm going to take the amino acids and I'm going to funnel these amino acids, I'm going to denote it with AA, into a specific pathway. Look what it's going to form as a result. The result of this is actually going to be the formation of glucose. When I take glycerol converted into when I take glycerol converted into glucose, or I take amino acids and convert it into glucose, what is that reaction called? What is this whole step right here called? This right here is called gluconeogenesis. Not only can it use amino acids, but you know your muscles are also producing what's called lactic acid. So your muscles can also produce what's called lactic acid. It can also take that lactic acid and use that as well to make glucose too. So that's not the only stimulus, it's just amino acids and lactic acid and glycerol. You could even use odd chain fatty acids too if you want to. But in general, we're just going to be talking about glycerol and amino acids here. But it can use lactic acid also. Okay? Now, very, very weird mechanism that can happen here with cortisol. Because generally cortisol wants to increase our blood glucose levels. Because usually this glucose, what's happening to it? You're actually going to get this glucose out of the liver and it's going to go into the bloodstream. Because its desire is to increase blood glucose levels, cause hyperglycemia. Cortisol normally wants to increase our blood glucose levels. That's his goal, and I'll explain why at the end. What's his stimulus? Now, what happens is something really weird. This is one of the weird mechanisms of cortisol. It can actually take glucose and convert it into glycogen, okay? So now, let's actually show you glycogen here. Let's say this is our glycogen molecule, and glycogen is just basically a long polymer of glucose. Okay, so let's move our lactic acid arrow out of the way here. Let's put him over here. Let's take our lactic acid and show it actually funneling in here, right there. Okay, because these guys can actually come together here and be involved in this pathway. Okay, so again, you have glycogen. Glycogen is basically the storage form of glucose. It's just a polymer of glucose molecules. But look what happens. Let's say I represent glucose over here by just like a little dot here. Actually, I'll just put glucose here. Let's say I take glucose. Cortisol direct effect on this pathway, it's very odd. It can take glucose and convert it into this polymer of glucose. What is this polymer of glucose called? This polymer of glucose is called glycogen. Okay? So this polymer of glucose here is called glycogen. Now, he can directly stimulate this pathway, right? He'll activate specific enzymes in the DNA and produce certain types of proteins, and these proteins, as a result, will stimulate the conversion of glucose into glycogen. What is that called when you take glucose and convert it into glycogen? That is called glycogenesis. So this right here is called glycogenesis. So it is directly involved in glycogenesis, which is converting glucose into glycogen directly. Now watch what else happens. This is the weird part. Okay, so you know cortisol loves to be able to enhance the sympathetic nervous system. You know how it does it? Look what cortisol can do. He can act on a lot of different types of tissues that are dependent or sensitive to norepinephrine. So let's say that cortisol comes over here and it acts on a smooth muscle cell. Because you know smooth muscle cells within our blood vessels are very sensitive to the norepinephrine. So he can actually stimulate specific genes, and these specific genes, look what they can do. They can come over here and they can increase the sensitivity of these adrenergic receptors. You see this little G protein coupled receptor? Look what cortisol does. He acts on these smooth muscle cells in our blood vessels, so the tunica media, and he can increase the sensitivity of these adrenergic receptors. Because look, here's a neuron, right? This neuron is an adrenergic neuron, meaning that it releases what chemicals? It releases, let's actually do this in blue, it releases norepinephrine. So this actually releases norepinephrine. Look what the norepinephrine does. It binds onto this receptor, and usually what's the result of norepinephrine binding onto the smooth muscle cells within the tunica media? The overall result is called vasoconstriction. So what's the overall result here? It's called vasoconstriction. Who's enhancing this process? Cortisol. Cortisol is increasing the sensitivity to norepinephrine. How? By increasing the sensitivity of these adrenergic receptors, so that when norepinephrine acts on it, the effect is amplified. So it causes an increase in vasoconstriction. What's the result of vasoconstriction? What does that do to the actual resistance on our blood vessels? It amps it up. So as a result, what's going to happen to the blood pressure here? It's going to increase our blood pressure. Okay, so that's one effect of cortisol. One effect of cortisol is he's causing excessive vasoconstriction by increasing the sensitivity of these adrenergic receptors and increasing the BP. Look what else he can do. Cortisol can act on the liver. And look what happens here. Super interesting. It comes over here and stimulates these receptors. What are these receptors? These are adrenergic receptors. So you know norepinephrine is also secreted onto the liver, and look what it does to the liver. So here's our norepinephrine. It acts onto the liver cells. When it acts onto the liver cells, guess what this liver is responsible for doing? He breaks the glycogen down into glucose. So he does the opposite reaction. So let's show that with this arrow. So look at this one. This is going to be specifically the pathway for norepinephrine. So what is norepinephrine doing? He's stimulating the conversion of glycogen into glucose. That's called glycogenolysis. But cortisol is helping that process indirectly. You see how that's a little interesting here? Is that cortisol's direct effect on this glycogen metabolism is what? He directly stimulates glycogenesis. But at the same time, cortisol is also increasing the sensitivity of these adrenergic receptors. For who? Norepinephrine. So that when norepinephrine binds onto these receptors on the liver, guess what? The glycogenolysis pathway is enhanced. And so you're breaking down glycogen into glucose. And as a result, what's happening to the glucose levels in the blood? It's going up. So as a result, look what's going to happen here. You're increasing your blood glucose levels, okay? But remember, only time that you're increasing the blood glucose levels is due to the indirect activity of cortisol acting on these adrenergic receptors, so that when norepinephrine binds onto it, the effect is more amplified. All right, so now it's also going to affect our immune system. It's going to affect our immune system. Okay, so how is it affecting the immune system? Let's say cortisol comes out here. So here's our cortisol, right? So this purple dot is representing cortisol. Look what cortisol can do. It can inhibit specific processes within inside of these immune cells, right? So this would be like a monocyte, a lymphocyte, and a basophil, right? What are basophils responsible for secreting? It's really responsible for secreting a lot of different types of histamines, right? So it releases a lot of different types of histamines and leukotrienes and prostaglandins, a lot of different types of chemicals. Lymphocytes are responsible for secreting a lot of different types of interleukins, so a lot of different types of cytokines. And even monocytes are responsible for secreting different types of interleukins and cytokines, right? So these are responsible for basically being able to promote the inflammatory immune response. Look what cortisol does. He inhibits these immune system cells from producing different types of inflammatory cytokines, like interleukins, like interleukin 1, interleukin 4, interleukin 2, all those different types of chemicals. And it's inhibiting the release of histamines and leukotrienes and prostaglandins, a whole bunch of different types of chemicals that are basically alerting our immune system that there is microorganisms that are pathogenic and causing tissue damage. But cortisol is inhibiting this. You know how this makes sense? Here's why. Okay, let's actually come over here, because now I'm going to explain why this is actually significant. Okay, so we need to understand, now that we've looked at all the effects of cortisol, guess what the stimulus of cortisol is? It's going to make so much sense now, guys. Look, his main stimulus is it's not the main stimulus, I'm sorry, it's one of the very strong stimuli, but one of them is hypoglycemia. What's hypoglycemia? It's low blood glucose levels. What was his effect? It was to increase the blood glucose levels. How? What was the way that it treated hypoglycemia? So if we look at hypoglycemia here, what did it do? It caused glycogenolysis, but let's put this in specific parentheses here. We have to understand this. Indirectly. This is so important. Indirectly. How? It does this by increasing sensitivity to norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is really the one who's doing glycogenolysis, but cortisol is increasing the sensitivity of those adrenergic receptors, so that when norepinephrine binds onto the liver's adrenergic receptors, guess what happens? Glycogenolysis is amplified, and that increases blood glucose levels. What's the prime metabolic effect, though, here with the glucose levels with cortisol? It's gluconeogenesis, which is taking amino acids and glycerol and lactic acid and odd-chain fatty acids and turning it into glucose. And what was the result of that? It was increasing blood glucose levels. What's the result of glycogenolysis? It's increasing blood glucose levels. And now that odd function of cortisol directly is glycogenesis. And we need to remember that this is what again? This is the direct effect. Okay, so that should make sense now why these mechanisms have happened. What's another stimulus? Another stimulus is actually going to be stress. So let's put here, but more like long-term stress or chronic stress. This should make sense by all means. Why? Okay. Stress is not the kind of stress that you're technically thinking about. It's talking about more like trauma or like, basically like starvation if you haven't eaten in a long time. A lot of different things that are causing long-term stress in the body, not just necessarily the stress you think about whenever, you're talking about your job or something like that. It's just long-term effectors of stress. Now, long-term stress can cause direct release of corticotropin-releasing hormone and can cause the excessive release of ACTH, and that produces lots of cortisol. How did cortisol deal with stress? Come back over here. Let's look. What did it do to your nervous system? Cause vasoconstriction. What happens when you have vasoconstriction? It increases your blood pressure. That's one way of dealing with stress, is we're increasing our blood pressure so that we can get more nutrients, more glucose, more amino acids to the tissue cells. What else was it doing? It was catabolizing different proteins. That's not something that you want. So whenever you're starving yourself for a long period of time, you have protein catabolism. And what else? It depresses your immune system. That's so important. So again, it depresses your immune system. So let's write that down now. So what is it doing with long-term stress? With the long-term stress aspect, it's actually causing what? Protein catabolism of the muscles, mainly. Catabolism. It's also causing what? Increase blood pressure. By how? Increasing the sensitivity to our actual blood vessels to norepinephrine, which causes vasoconstriction. And it depresses immune system. And last example here to let you understand how this is effective. If you guys are taking finals, which you guys probably are, or you're taking a test, and you start having a lot of long-term stress on the body. Because when I talk about stress, it could mean not just, like I said, trauma or certain types of situations where you're not being able to get enough nutrients like starvation, but it could be long-term stressors like preparing for your final. If you're preparing for your final, a lot of stress is coming on your body. When there's a lot of stress on your body, what happens to your immune system? Your immune system gets depressed. If your immune system is depressed and it's not able to release certain types of inflammatory mediators and let your immune system know that there's bacteria in the area, what happens? Your immune system lets its guard down, and microorganisms start actually causing damage to the tissue cells and causing infections. And what happens to these people? They get sick. You ever notice that a lot of people get sick before their finals? That's the reason why, because it's depressing your immune system. It's bringing down that guard and exposing ourselves to more different types of bacterial infections. That's why they use cortisol in certain types of leukemias to treat it by depressing the bone marrow from producing white blood cells, or from actually decreasing the actual inflammatory cytokines. All right, guys, last thing here. With cortisol. Cortisol is different from aldosterone and from other different types of hormones. He's interesting because let's say that I take over here two different scenarios. Let's say I put over here on the left side, high cortisol levels, right? So high cortisol. And then let's say I put right here, let's say I put low cortisol. So two different situations. Whenever there's really high cortisol, look what cortisol does to the hypothalamus. It comes up to the hypothalamus and exerts a negative feedback on the hypothalamus, which decreases the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone. Look what else it does. It inhibits the anterior pituitary from releasing ACTH. What's the function of ACTH? To stimulate the synthesis of cortisol. If you don't release ACTH, what happens to the cortisol production then? It goes down. That's the way that our body deals with that. What if it's low though? If there's low cortisol, then not as much of this cortisol is going up to the actual hypothalamus. And if not as much of it is going up to the hypothalamus, it's not going to be causing a lot of inhibitory effect on the paraventricular nucleus and the hypothalamus. So therefore, these nuclei are stimulated. And guess what happens? They release a lot of CRH. It also doesn't put as much inhibitory stimuli on the anterior pituitary. And if there's not a lot of inhibitory stimuli here, it's going to release more ACTH. What happens when you release more ACTH? It helps to stimulate the synthesis of cortisol. That's the way that our body deals with elevated and decreased levels of cortisol. All right, Ninja Nerds, I hope all of this made sense. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. In the next video, we're going to talk about the actual zona reticularis and the hormones that it produces. All right, Ninja Nerds, until next time.